But once again, the people who are doing this knowingly with full knowledge, full control, and just have zero empathy for the people who they're basically humiliating almost or insulting in doing this. But shame on you. Get a life.
Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So today's episode is actually suggested by my son. So being a very psychologically minded household, he brought forward some concerns from things that he saw on YouTube. So more specifically, he came across a number of videos with mostly teens and young adults portraying themselves as either having a particular psychological disorder or even saying things like they wish that they had a particular psychological disorder or they feel that they should. So he actually compiled a number of different videos for us to watch today. So I think we'll start out and kind of look at what we see, what we think, and provide some evidence for and against what we're seeing. So let's watch the first one.
Oh God! Moving on. Send me to Canada! I'll get her a new one. Wow! 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 Eat the burrito. Nope. One for you! Woo! Woo! Pew, 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 pew. Mine. 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 Oh, no. Nope. Nope. Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Nursery rhymes with Tourette's. 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed. One fell down. He's dead now. Bye-bye! Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock and stole his cock. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catch a tiger, he's a hoe!
Okay. So I guess we can maybe start by talking a little bit about Tourette's and maybe some, I would say, misconceptions about it. So a lot of those videos there are showing individuals who have tics surrounding, uttering swear words or, huge motor movements. But typically, those who have Tourette's are usually more inclined to experience minor motor movements, minor sounds, and not to mention the severity of the symptom presentation is usually more highlighted in childhood, early adolescence, and is seen less so. I'm assuming that this person is, 20 or so. So that's not as likely, or these people that they're showing were, I would say, in their early 20s. So that kind of stands out to me initially as far as some things that seem a little bit off as far as what we typically know about Tourette's.
Yeah. Now, the second one with the nursery rhymes, okay, that just the Tourette's just happens to rhyme and it just happens to come at the end of the stanza and everything like that. That's not how Tourette's operates. Okay. And if this person, we don't know these people, so we have to be careful. Maybe there's something going on here. But I'm going to presume or infer that she doesn't have real Tourette's, or if she does, that wasn't actual Tourette's. And so, especially if she doesn't have Tourette's, for my patients who do, I'm not an expert on Tourette's, but I have several patients who do have Tourette's. And as you say, yes, they're more minor. It's more internalized. They feel it. And like they say, it's like twitching constantly. And I say sometimes, like I could see sometimes that they are reacting to the internal reaction. right? It's not that I'm noticing the actual internal reaction. It's just their reaction because they're upset because it's constant. And what they're going through can distract them. And that's what I'm watching. I'm seeing the distraction. I'm seeing them being upset at the internal twitching, but not the actual manifestation itself. Now, sometimes I do see that as well. Like I can actually see it. But yes, you're right. It's not this dramatic. And so shame on anybody, whether it's these people or anyone else who is either trying to make money off of this, is trying to get some fame off of this, or somehow is trying to make themselves feel like a special person because they're convincing themselves that they have an actual disorder, which is extremely serious, extremely disruptive, and extremely distressing to the people who have it.
Yeah, and likewise, I'm certainly not an expert on it, but have worked with individuals who have it, and it can often be described as like the tic kind of feels like an itch that's coming on, and they, sometimes even have to do it multiple times until it feels just right. And again, I don't know these people in these videos, but I didn't see any of that type of behavior or distress or discomfort associated with these tics. There was almost, the one was laughing, right?
They both were laughing.
I'd be surprised. Yeah, I would be surprised if, somebody in real life, I hate to say, would be laughing about the distressing nature of some of these tics. And again, if they are as old as they are, chances are, and I'm speaking very generally here, but chances are they've been living with this for some time. So likely would have a little bit better understanding of the tics and what they feel like and when they're coming on and what triggers them. So it seems convenient that they had their phone recording them in the midst of that. And it's interesting because I can't remember if it was 2020 or somewhere surrounding the pandemic, there was actually an emergence of social contagion surrounding people presenting with tic disorders. So that's really interesting too. And I actually was looking in the DSM about what the actual prevalence is. It's something like 3 to 9 out of 1,000 young people in the population have it. So again, I know with the internet, we can see a greater slice of the population, but it's such a rare disorder that I'm surprised to see so many people claiming to present with it.
Well, I'm not surprised because the keyword is claim, right? And it is social contagion, and the people that I saw with it, okay, and again, some of them you could see they were getting enjoyment out of what they were doing. So I don't think it was actual. Others, it was more, let's say, constrained, more restrained, maybe looking a bit more like Tourette's. And, maybe some of them actually had Tourette's. But once again, for my patients who have any type of condition, when they see other people trying to get some kind of clout or feeling special based on something that they feel is a curse, it's a shame. There's no better word than to say shame on you if you are doing this. And if you are so, let's say, weak-minded, weak-willed, I hate to sound so unempathetic, I don't speak like this with my patients, but if you have such a lack of character or anything else going for you that you need to convince yourself that you have these conditions, then I feel bad for you. I actually feel sorry for you. And I want to be very clear here. There's a big difference between somebody, let's say, who is feeling depressed or feeling blue, thinking they have major depression. That's fine. I don't think you're doing that for likes. Versus somebody who is acting so dramatically, and be quite frank, childish. Those two people that we saw were childish, immature, acting like little children. And again, if someone has Tourette's and do have these manifestations of it, I'm not going to call them childish or immature. I want to be very clear here. It was this behavior. They're giggling while they're doing it. They're making all these, again, bizarre sounds. Once again, Tourette's can have bizarre sounds and everything like that. But the way they were doing it, it looked to me, I could be wrong, but it looked like play acting and not very good play acting. It was insulting.
Yeah. I was going to say it looks very orchestrated. So I'm seeing the same thing. And I think that there's a very fine line, which they've crossed, but there's a fine line between bringing awareness to the public about rare disorders versus sensationalizing it and again, orchestrating what it looks like something. I really hesitate to say what I'm about to say here, but it seems orchestrated. I guess we'll leave it at that.
Well, again, I don't know anybody who has a Tourette's whose Tourette's, comes at the end of a poem with a perfect rhyme, and that just happens to be sexualized. Okay, I don't know anybody who's got that and did it on cue like that. Come on, and if someone, by the way, if someone knows someone who actually has that and is not acting, please let me know. Please correct me.
Of
I've
course.
never heard
Yeah.
anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, should we watch the next video? All right.
Okay, so what is my most repetitive tic?
Literally, you punch people.
Anything else?
You like slap people.
Okay. Okay, so what is your favorite tic of mine?
When you always touch my boobs, you're like, boobs.
Oh boy. So this touches on a lot of what we just said. Again, making it into something humorous or comical, or it's no laughing matter. Again, it's a serious neurological disorder that people suffer greatly from. I just find that video offensive, frankly.
Yeah, and now here's the thing: we didn't actually see how she was acting. We didn't see her, slapping, punching, or touching people's breasts.
Mm-hmm.
So, we don't even know whether she actually has, Tourette's. Who knows? Because somebody could. Saying boobs while touching the breasts, I don't know if that would actually happen. It just seems, again, too synchronous. Okay. I'm not quite sure. One or the other, maybe, but saying it together, it's possible. And I don't know enough. That would be a specific case. But as you say, making light of it, they're all smiling and everything. Now, if someone, I want to be clear here, if someone has a condition, whether it's physical, psychological, neurological, whatever, and they're able to laugh at it in a positive way, not to,
Sure,
right,
yeah.
that's one thing, right? But in this case,
Yeah.
and I don't even know these friends, like, are they tolerant? We don't even know if she actually has this condition. So it's so hard to know whether she's using this as an excuse to act out, right? Or whether she seriously has it. And if she does seriously have it and she's able to own it, and she talks to the friends and they don't shun her for having it, great. I'm actually happy. That's empowering. Right?
Of course. Yeah.
But if they're trying to do this, and if, again, I don't know the rest of this person's videos. I don't know if she has lots of these things. I'm not quite sure. But we have to be mindful that that the way you present it, the way you talk about it, the way other people talk about it, it could really land in unintended ways with people who have these conditions as well. So I just hope if anyone does have these conditions, like truly does, and is trying to make these videos for either educational purposes or empowering people and so on, just remember, not everybody sees things through the same lens that you do. So I hope that you'll be mindful that if for other people, they might find it offensive, it might land. Now, look, everyone is offended by something these days. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that's objectively offensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And perhaps this is neither here nor there, but I think it's worth mentioning that these videos that we've watched are all females. And it's my understanding that especially with the younger population, there is a higher prevalence among males versus females with Tourette. So just an interesting observation that we're not seeing any male videos.
Yeah. Having said that, now maybe your son, maybe he, was like, he's
Maybe
the curator of the video,
surprised,
so we
but-
don't know. Okay, maybe certain people catch his eye more than others. We don't know. So that could be the case as well. Right? Although I don't know.
Fair.
But having said that, when I look at these videos, I don't know how many males normally, when we see these kinds of things, are doing this. So. Right. In general,
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not to say they don't exist, but I do think it is a much higher number. And I don't want to go into a whole other branch, but when we see these kinds of social contagions, whether it's social contagion that people truly think that they have a disorder, which they don't, or social contagion in the sense that they start acting reprehensively, thinking that it's the right thing to do or that it's going to get them popularity and so on, right? If we can see this happening in so many conditions, and let's just say quickly that one, and I don't know if we'll see a video later on at some point, but people with eating disorders, people with body image issues, we do know for fact that is something that can develop, or it does develop largely through social contagion. So when we see this happening with some conditions, to assume that it can't happen with other conditions, other phenomena, other identities that people claim, which we've talked about in other videos, it would be ridiculous. It's people selectively ignoring the evidence. So again, this is just, to me, this is evidence that people, again, whether they truly believe they have it or whether they're doing it for whatever self-serving reason, either partially thinking they have it or knowing they don't have it, but trying to get some kind of clout or something else like that. We do know that young people and statistically speaking, females are more inclined to be affected by this social contagion. So once again, anyone who denies a social contagion can happen in other situations is denying the evidence, and you have to question what is their ideology that prevents them from seeing this reality.
Yeah, and I like the way you frame that. It makes it seem, so obvious the way that you said it, that with eating disorders, which are a psychological condition, if social contagion it has been proven to impact the development of that, what makes other disorders immune to that?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Let's check out the next one.
Trying to figure out who is fronting. Am I just a simple human alter? I've got monsters in my head, so I mask as a human, even though it tears me apart. Being hidden and not able to speak when you are married in the headspace and a singlet asks you out. Our emo/punk alters, the majority of the system, glad we stopped listening to country music teenage era. The group of alters from that era, plus the ones that just enjoy country music, and pick a she/it monster. I was looking at my diagnosis and they finally added autism to it.
Okay, so it looks like they're referring to dissociative identity disorder in this video. So the first thing that jumps out to me here is the fact that there seems to be far more continuity than would be expected with respect to these different alters, as she referred to them. And yes, it looks like the videos were recorded separately and stitched together, and that's fine. But it seems odd that she was able to record each and every version of that. So that's the first thing that stands out to me. Second of all, I'm not sure, and I know, Oren, you and I have talked about this in terms of, does the main personality have awareness of the other personalities? So my understanding with regard to dissociative amnesia is that when they are disassociated into these other identities, they oftentimes don't have memory of it happening. So if that is the case, how did she know to record each one? So that stands out to me as odd.
Yeah. Now, I know a number of colleagues, and it's not just personally knowing, but throughout the profession, the question of dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, it's very contentious. It is in the DSM, and if you ask any like a large group of psychiatrists or psychologists, the numbers have changed. I think in the past, the vast majority said no, it is not real, and then I think it shifted to, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, more people saying yes, it is real, because with the shifting of dissociative identity disorder, dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue states, like where they're trying to say that yes, people can have some type of disconnect from their present day reality. We know people do that with daydreaming. We know that there's like highway hypnosis. You can be driving for a long period of time and not remember. Like, wait a second. Wow, 30 minutes passed. I literally don't remember having gotten from A to B, but I got there. Okay. So, and we know that people can sleepwalk. So we do know that people can have these, let's say that your body is acting a certain way. You seem to be in control of your actions, yet there's no conscious memory of it. So I do believe, and I've actually seen patients disassociate in my office, like completely not be there. And sometimes I can communicate with them. It is so bizarre, and we can't do justice to it in the podcast, and also maintaining confidentiality. But I do truly believe that people can dissociate. And we do know that with DID, or dissociative identity disorder, we do know that most people claim to have or have been shown to have had a very abusive, childhood, and repetitively abusive. So if you're unable to physically escape from hell, it makes sense that somehow part of your mind, especially when your mind is young and is forming, is able to sort of retreat. And I've had patients who tell me like they retreated to a little cubby, to a closet, to and that's where they go. And when they dissociate as an adult, they can tell me that that's where they've gone again. And so I do believe that it's real. And I do believe that when people have had trauma, especially repeated trauma of the worst types, that this can happen. And I've heard many arguments against it. And one of the arguments is, and we have to understand this, is that many people who supposedly had DID have been shown that it was caused through hypnosis. They're they're highly suggestible. And, whether in a hypnotic state, usually in a hypnotic state, the therapist either inadvertently or maliciously implanted certain thoughts into their mind. And it usually has to do with childhood assault, usually childhood sexual assault. So I get that. And these cases have been proven to have happened. But just because some cases have been proven to happen doesn't mean that all cases are not real. So I just want to put all of that out there before we even talk about whether these people seem to have it. Okay. And by the way, so I've also heard from other people that there's like a quasi DID. So it's not real. The person is aware of all these states, but they just, and these are people with autism, by the way, and the people I've heard from who've said that they do feel like they have these different personalities. They're aware of them. They know they have them, and they even give names to them. And it's like the classic DID where there's different people, but they're fully aware. And they're saying that I know it's not actually DID, but it just, they don't feel integrated. That I don't feel like I'm a complete person. I have these different aspects. We all have different aspects of ourselves, but these people seem to be disjointed, disconnected, not a complete whole. And so I just, so some people might experience that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I'll add there too, with regard to disassociation, for myself, working with a high population of people with PTSD, disassociation is unfortunately a common symptom. And I too have seen people disassociate in the midst of a therapy session, and it can be quite distressing. But interestingly, those who have been dealing with it for a long time are able to kind of move through it and say, okay, well, there's that again, and, move on from it. So, want to add that it can be part of PTSD as well. But what's interesting about DID is that these dissociative disorders have their own section in the DSM-5, and the way that it's phrased there is that the authors recognize that they are adjacent to trauma, but not the same as trauma. So I find that really interesting, the way that it's worded currently in the DSM.
Okay. Yeah.
But they do also acknowledge that, like you said, it's oftentimes in people who have dealt with childhood abuse, sexual abuse, human trafficking, being imprisoned, and things like that. So I imagine the main difference between those dealing with PTSD-related dissociations versus DID would be perhaps a prolonged experience with trauma, and that the brain's desire to retreat from that in some way.
That would make sense. And by the way, when people are dissociating with PTSD, from what I've heard from them, is that they feel like they have the total memory of what happened. They completely remember, right? It's just that things are becoming unreal in the moment. So it's terrifying if you're driving, and suddenly you're having a flashback, you're reliving what you had experienced before. So there's that dissociation, a sense of dissociation and disconnectedness. But it's, again, they know they have full memory of what happened. Or partial memory, far more than what we'd expect with DID or the other dissociative disorders, right? So, and again, bringing up the PTSD or complex PTSD, the important thing is that people recognize that these are so severe. They have such an impact on the other person. So for someone making these videos, and I'm not going to besmirch the person we just saw. I don't know if it doesn't seem like it, but and they all said they had autism. So right. So something's going on here. But anyway, once again, for people to adopt these supposed disorders and again almost enjoy it or get clout or say, hey, look at me, I got something. It does such a disservice. It's such an insult to the people who truly have these conditions. I mean, seriously, I'll stop myself. And there's so many words I could say to describe anyone who would do that knowingly. Once again, if someone feels that they have it, first of all, you feel that you have it and you're suffering, then I feel terrible for you. Okay, and suffering is suffering. Even if you don't have it and you're suffering. If you're not sure, but you need it because you need a desperate need to feel some type of importance or self-worth or something that I need to count in some way, I feel bad for you. I feel sorry for you. But once again, the people who are doing this knowingly with full knowledge, full control, and just have zero empathy for the people who they're basically humiliating almost or insulting in doing this. Once again, I hate to say it, but shame on you. Get a life.
Yeah. And that's what I take issue with is, and again, this video in particular, I don't know, of course, but there certainly are those out there who claim to have something that they don't, just to capitalize off of the suffering of others. And that's just terrible. Again, lots of words that I could insert there, but we'll leave it at that.
Right. Just one thing, just because I mentioned CPTSD, someone who watched the videos had commented that when we talked about CPTSD in a previous video, right? I said that in the DSM, it's not listed as CPTSD. There, of course, we have PTSD, but it's not a disorder in the DSM. It may be in the ICD. The International Classification of Disorders, Volume 11, that like in European countries and other countries that they use it. Okay, but someone took umbrage with the fact that I said it's not a real disorder. What I meant was it's not in the DSM, but we were talking about that. I want to be very clear here. people who have CPTSD, like they experienced prolonged either trauma or extreme
Absolutely.
adversity, right, and hardships that has a lasting impact on their brain. So I want to make it clear that there's no doubt that it exists. My wording, and I thought my wording was fine, but the person did take umbrage. So I just want, if anyone else felt that way, I just want to be very clear here. I was just meaning that it wasn't in the DSM, but it is recognized in the ICD-11 and maybe previously.
Yeah, and there is rumblings that the next version of the DSM will possibly likely have it, and that comes from, at the moment, there isn't enough research for them to, feel confident in adding it in, but it absolutely is a real thing. We see it every day in the work that we do.
Right. Okay. And once again, the reason when we have these videos, we're not just shitting on these people making stupid videos. We're trying to bring, awareness and compassion to people who are, experiencing these kinds of conditions and issues and phenomena.
Absolutely. All right. So let's check out the next video.
Do you have any regrets about taking your own vision or the process with which you did take your own vision?
I don't have any regrets taking my vision. I believe I should have been born blind, and I'm happy the way I am. I do have some regrets about the way I did it, but in the end, I'm happy the way I am.
Dr. Phil, with all due respect to Jewel, but I am having a really hard time sitting so close to someone who traumatized herself, who damaged herself. We took an oath in medicine to help people. We see horrible tragedies every single day as doctors, and people who would give anything to go back and restore their vision, their health. My heart is beating out of my chest. I can't even make sense of the emotions I'm feeling, because to hear someone say, I've always felt I should be blind. Well, I've always felt I should be the Queen of England, but I'm not going out to become the Queen of England.
Huh. Okay. Well, this one obviously hits close to home for me, and I had heard of this story before. It's my understanding she apparently, through the guidance of a psychologist, by the way, poured bleach in her eyes so that she could go blind, because she felt that she should have been born blind. And I'm holding back profanity here, because as a blind person, there's nothing good about this. And yes, I can say that I've grown, I've overcome adversity, I've developed resiliency, blah, 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 blah. But would I rather have not? Absolutely. So I don't know what psychological condition we could categorize this under, but I'm sorry, I'm going to say very boldly, there is something significantly psychologically malfunctioning if somebody thinks that that's, how they should be.
Right. And the thing is, now here we go, I've got to be careful. But I'll call it out. I mean, I was alluding to something earlier about social contagion. So when people talk about people with gender-related issues, where they claim to, have a certain identity and so on, and we've talked about trans people. So none of this is in any way to denigrate people with gender-related issues. But what I am saying is, some people are saying it, let's say, as a jerk. Other people are saying it professionally and medically, where they say, or psychologically, where they say, what if someone comes in and says, and because we know these conditions exist, I don't want this arm. This arm does not feel right for me. It doesn't feel like it's part of my body, and so on. And they want to have it surgically removed or amputated. And some people have, pushed for that to happen. Well, this woman believes she should be blind. She should not have vision. And you're saying, I didn't know this, that because I heard the story as well, I saw the video, but I hadn't known that she was guided by a psychologist to do this. Okay. Basically, it's living your true, authentic self. If that's how you feel, then instead of saying, well, let's look at what type of, neurological, psychological, environmental conditions or, experiences led you to develop such a, let's say, disturbing belief. And let's help you work with that, versus saying, let's help you actualize it. And so once again, I am not saying that if somebody says that they are transgender, that we shouldn't explore them. Let's say, I don't want to get into too much, but let's just say, I'm not saying that, for all trans people, we have to treat them the same way as we would treat someone, again, who comes in saying, I want to blind myself. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that when people raise these issues, these questions, again, whether they're being a jerk or whether they're being a professional, they get treated the same way. How dare you? We're not even allowed to discuss this. And this is showing, right, how politics is overtaking and political correctness is overtaking the field of mental health. So we have to be able to have these discussions. And once again, if a professional is saying we know these things exist, it doesn't mean we're just trying to be a jerk. It doesn't mean we're trying to deny the existence of trans people. We're saying, let's look at the reason that someone might say, I want to have my genitals removed or my breasts removed and so on. There might be something going on more than simply saying some gendered soul is telling them that, this is the right thing to be their authentic self. And even if someone believes it's my authentic self, once again, should we say, if my authentic self is to blind myself, that we should go ahead and facilitate that?
And it's interesting because as you're saying all this, again, I'm reflecting on, what blindness means in my life and how it contributes to or has contributed to my personality development and so on and so forth. So, at the same time, if somebody could wave a magic wand and, I could have full vision restored, that's a really interesting kind of thought experiment for me as well, because, while it was difficult, it is part of who I am. But I don't think that the converse can be said, meaning somebody can't just, go blind purposefully, willfully, and, develop all of these personality traits and great things that perhaps could come along from it. So I really ponder, like, what on earth would somebody hope to gain from something like that, other than maybe a sense of belonging to a certain community, or something along those lines. Like I'm really, and I like the analogy that you drew as far as, no pun intended, us as professionals blindly following what a client says without digging layers deeper when it comes to other issues as well. And I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but I'm really stumped as to, what one would hope to gain from doing something like this.
Yeah, I really don't know. Again, to me, it's one of a few things. Either it's a desperate attempt for some kind of notoriety, because if you do this, you're going to be notorious and, you'll be on all the TV shows and everything. Or there's some really serious something going on, some serious disturbance, for lack of a better word, in that person's psyche, in their psychological functioning, in their personality. And once again, if we know this can happen with someone like, doing this with the eyes, we know people amputate limbs and so on. So then why is it that genitals and other parts of the body are,
why are those off limits? And that's okay.
Right. And then they say, well, it's not just that, they have this other stuff about, and there's a very prescribed path of how they want to be. Well, listen to this blind woman, right? If we listen to her story, I am sure she's going to say something very similar, that she'll have something in her mind that makes sense. And and other people probably have it too. Well, there's not that many of them. Well, what percentage of people does it take for us to say that, okay, it's legitimate? So, and again, we can go on and on. I don't want to make this all about the transition, but I'm just saying that once again, when people deny that these kinds of things happen, they are denying reality. And once again, you and I were talking about this with A, with compassion, and B, with a mind toward facilitating critical thinking. We need to step outside of our feelings. We need to be able to look at the evidence, and we need to think, what is the best practices approach? What does the evidence say is the best way to help people with a variety of these kinds of issues? And I don't know, with someone who, let's say, needs to be blind, I'm not quite again, because I don't know her and I don't know what her situation was. But is there any way to unhook her from that rigid belief that this is the way to be, this is how to actualize myself?
And I would say, at the risk of oversimplifying, of course there is, right? As therapists, that's what we do, is we figure out what is underlying it and what thoughts are sticking you in this mindset. So, again, I feel like I could go on about this forever, but as far as what you said there, we as practitioners need to be more open-minded. We as a society need to think more critically. We need to not lead with feelings. While feelings are important, of course, as therapists, we think that, but we can't lead every decision with feelings, which I guess leads me to looking at the commonality of all of these videos that we watched in terms of what people can do with all of this is, I think in large part what is fueling a lot of this, and again, I'm going to preface over and over again so nobody misconstrues what we're saying. We don't know these people. We don't know what's happening with them psychologically. So I'm speaking generally here. But I think in many of these cases where people are either exaggerating symptoms or making up symptoms, whatever the case may be, I think that there's a significant lack of belongingness. This is a very important need that we all have. And in terms of what can be done and what would be more productive than engaging in this type of behavior would be finding a community, finding like-minded people, connecting with people face to face instead of on social media, and developing that sense of belonging, because I think that is what is the common thread in all of these. Is I sense that that's what's missing in their lives.
So I will add to that. First of all, 100%, we are social animals. And we've talked about this in other podcasts as well, that especially from a young age, if you feel disconnected from the people around you, whether it's your family, especially your peer group, right? Or you feel different somehow, which is ironic because this is a way to make yourself feel really, really different. But somehow this difference is now in today's society a way to be accepted. So if you're feeling that type of, again, disconnect, isolation, loneliness, and loneliness, you can have 100 people around you and still feel lonely if you don't feel part of or the same as the people around you, the people who count to you. Right. So either A, if you're in that person, right, as you say, find people who can maybe help you, feel connected, for lack of a better word. And B, if you're a parent, and you have a child who's going through these things, think about that. Like, how can you get them with other people where they feel comfortable? Because parents say, okay, put them on a team, put them in this group, put them in that group, get them to join, to start a hobby or something. You've got to make sure, especially if you're trying to find social groups, you have to make sure that that's not causing a bigger problem. Because if you send a child who's feeling awkward, socially, inept, not connected to others, and you put them in a group where their, let's say, shortcomings are going to flourish, like they're going to be even more magnified, you're doing more harm than good. So as you say, finding like-minded people, finding people where they would feel connected and comfortable. I keep using this. It's a bit late for the end of the podcast, but connected. That's my drinking word. Okay. But then the second thing, the most important connectedness is a connection to your sense of self, your own well-being, who you are as a person, your identity. And I really believe that not just feeling disconnected from others, but from the sense of self. And we know that there are a lot of personality conditions where the person doesn't, whether it's their emotions, whether it's their thoughts, whether it's their identity, that they just don't feel grounded. They don't have a core sense of who I am. And I think a lot of these people are lacking that. And whether it's just, a disconnect from themselves, or they feel that whoever I am is not sufficient to somehow make it in the world, or once again, to your point, to be accepted in the world and by the people around them, right? Start with that. Try to figure out, like, it's the most important question. Who am I? Well, we need to start that, and to recognize that whoever you are, there's always room for improvement, right? But whoever you are, start from that and try to build on that in a methodical, in a let's say a way that makes sense, and the way that might lead to consequences. What these people are doing is going from here to, I won't even say here, it's like left, right, and like somewhere else, like all over the place, right? It's a huge leap. And they're not prepared for what's going to happen, especially if they are faking it, or again, they've developed through social contagion, the pseudo condition. Well, if that becomes part of your identity, once it's gone, once you realize, well, this isn't helping me and so on, so many people are terrified then of losing the notoriety or of losing the acceptance and everything else like that. And if your acceptance and so on is based on a lie, a fabrication, an exaggeration, a distortion, well, where does that leave you? So I hope people can think about that before they take those, ridiculous steps forward or backward in reality.
Yeah. Yeah, really. Yeah. So listeners, we want to know what you think of these videos, about our comments and thoughts on it. If we're way off base, let us know. If you agree with us, let us know. Leave your comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
And on that note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.